Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Solidarity Live. It has been a very busy week in Washington. How are you doing, Alex?
Really well. How about you?
Oh, you know, exciting night last night. I'm fine.
Yeah, good.
To be clear, we had that night together, everyone. We all went out. Big work family. It was fun.
It was Netroots Nation sort of in exile because the conference is all virtual, but some of us came together to engage in solidarity, and it had been a long time since we got to see each other, and it was really nice to plot and scheme in person, not just through the screens. I will disagree with you about one thing, though. I mean, yes, it was busy, but like this was the lullest week in a while because we're sort of like reshuffling the game board after what happened last week, where the mercenary corporate Dems were trying to disaggregate the Build Back Better from the BIF, the bipartisan infrastructure thing, and the progressives said, no, we're going to actually pass our agenda, which is also Biden's agenda. And that was a wonderful showdown. We talked about it last week, but this week, everyone is sort of arranging themselves on the board for the next part of the negotiation, which is the real big sad. And we've talked about this before, but the big sad is when we move from the everybody gets a policy stage. I think of it as the Oprah stage, right? Like you get a policy, you get a policy, you get a policy. And then now, because somehow Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are, the regal arbiters of all things in this country, we're being told that we have to cut things, but they won't tell us what to cut. They'll just say numbers, as if the numbers don't actually have direct impact on people's lives, as if we're not talking about adding vision, hearing, dental to Medicare or negotiating prescription drug prices. They want, Manchin and Sinema want to blow holes in the policy at the behest of the corporate paymasters, but they don't want to take the political hit for that. They want somebody else to take the political hit. And we really need people to understand that this is Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who they want to get rid of paid family leave. Paid family leave right now is super imperiled. That's what we are all being told in DC. The whole thing might go away unless we force them to keep it in. But Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are doing that. And today we're going to have a show. It's not about paid family leave. The other thing that's most imperiled is housing. It's about these corporate paymasters. Who are they? Because, and we talk about this all the time, but pharma has this entire city just locked up, sewn up so tight, and their entire business model, it only is Washington, D.C. They don't have a business unless you have Washington, D.C. granting them these patent monopolies and otherwise protecting their ability to charge whatever they want, whatever monopoly price they want. And they usually set it at a level that kills some people. So some people die so that everyone else is terrified enough that they'll go bankrupt to afford the drugs that they or a loved one need. And I read this piece, Jocelyn. I sent it to you as soon as I read it and said, we have to get Natalie on the show. And Natalie Shure wrote this for the New Republic. She's a columnist there. And it's just, it's beautiful and simple. And that's what I think is so important about it, because I sometimes spin out on the complexities of policy and everything. But the headline is Big Pharma's Revolving Door is Imperiling Democracy. And Natalie, I was super happy to read, and you just get right into it. This is what they're doing. They just buy Washington, D.C. They buy politicians to override the will of the people.
Yeah, I think that's, one of the main tricks in their quiver. And when you say that Washington is their business model, that's totally right. It's not just campaign donations. It's not just their massive lobby. It's the fact that laws are pretty amenable to what they're doing. They've got a very generous patent law. They have, laws that basically allow them to patent publicly funded research that was done at world-class universities. They have the fact that there is no public drug manufacturer, the way that there are public insurers that, can kind of siphon off some of the parts of the insurance system that aren't working. So I think that, all of those things are matters of policy, and they've got a very, very good deal. And it's not very surprising that they're going to fight tooth and nail to keep it.
Well, and could you, for people who don't know, how did it get this bad? Alex, you're not allowed to answer this.
So I think it's a number of things. I think that you really see drug prices start to take off like crazy in the 70s. And part of that is that there was some new, or 70s and 80s maybe, some of that is that there starts to be some new medical technology and the financialization of the economy more broadly. So you have, these new innovative drugs that really are unusual and more resource and technologically intensive. And then you have a ton of money going into this potentially lucrative sector. Politically, I think that's about when you get the rise of neoliberalism. That's when you start to see healthcare prices take off in the US relative to other countries more generally. And so I think that, you start to get it from there. And as I noted in the piece, I think another thing to understand about pharma versus some other aspects of the healthcare system, which we know, it has a ton of problems, some similar to this, some different, but ultimately pharma is producing a commodity. So, they are going to rely on churning out a product, amping up production, raising prices in a way that's a little harder to do with a straight up, service provider, the way that a hospital is. They can certainly engage in plenty of shenanigans, but it's not as straightforward as the pharmaceutical industry.
So Jocelyn alluded to the fact that I talk about this all the time. I'm more interested in hearing what you found in your investigation. I want you to just hear this because it really piggybacks off your piece. It's not just campaign donations. It's not just, money, lobbying. It's actually also personnel. It's actually that. So the part that people have a real hard time believing is that our tax dollars develop the drugs. All of the risk is on the U.S. taxpayer. So like the basic research, the stuff where it very often does not pan out, all the risk is borne by us. And then these corporations come in generally at the very end, and now sometimes not at all. Kesselheim did a paper that showed that 1 out of 4 molecules, they actually don't even come in the whole way. So it was all us. Like the Moderna vaccine. It's called the Moderna vaccine after this company that literally spent $0 on it. 100% of the funding came from U.S. taxpayers and Dolly Parton, $1 million. And I got fact checked by some corporate BS fact checkers saying, like, first of all, they didn't understand how funding works. So they said, oh, these universities also were part of it. So it wasn't all from taxpayers. I'm like, you just don't know what you're talking about. And you're fact checking me and the experts. Those universities were given tax dollars in order to develop it. That's our tax dollars. And then they moved it to needs more context, all hinged on Dolly Parton's $1 million donation. And I'm like, she also is a taxpayer. So yes, she went above and beyond. But the whole point is, Moderna put in $0, zero. And then we hand them the patent and say, now it's yours. How much can I pay you to sell me the thing that I invented? And they're like, way more than you can afford. That is our system. And there's this thing in there called tech transfer, where they're definitely figure out how to do it when it's handing it over to billion-dollar corporations. But when we say a variant is going to arise in COVID that's going to kill all humans, we're in an existential risk. And the only way to address that is to vaccinate the world. We need the technology, and we need to give it to everybody who can manufacture it. And the governments all around the world are like, give us the information and we will make the vaccines and vaccinate the world. And this company, who again spent $0, is like, nah, that's mine. We'll build a plant in Africa in 10 years. And you're like, I won't swear, Brad, for you. But it is infuriating to watch this. And unfortunately, most people are like really decent, and like, they're like, it can't be that bad. It can't just be a small cadre of sociopathic narcissists who are willing to let the world die as long as they can buy another yacht. And you're like, it is. That's what it is. And a part that you get into that I've seen so many times is the bureaucrats who are actually in the government, in charge of that tech transfer part, in charge of the regulation at the FDA, in charge of supposedly protecting the public health. They immediately go. So they're making, $112,000 or something. They have a good career trajectory or whatnot. But actually, a lot of people know they're going to cash out. And once they shepherd a molecule into the patent bank of one of these corporations, which is now worth billions of dollars, this molecule that they just acquired, that person goes and works for pharma. And pharma shamelessly does that. They hire up all of the people in Washington, D.C. That happens on that side and on the Hill, where their lobbyists are your former chiefs of staff. The people who come and sell you this are people who you respect and consider friends and peers. And also, the way D.C. works is basically you have to give these people meetings. They have so much access because they just buy up the personnel.
Yeah, and it goes both ways. I mean, obviously it's a huge problem when pharma buys up former public officials. I also think it's a huge problem when, politicians put former pharma execs in their administration or staffs. That's just as damaging. The fact that this is a circle of people that share the same values and, it's hard to remember who works for who at once. I think that that's really damaging and really frightening. And it's something that happens with pharma more than most other industries.
Jocelyn, can I follow up?
Yeah, sure.
And it's a freelance one, Natalie, so it's not the topic of your article, but I bet you're following that the NIH director is just stepping down, Francis Collins, and there's still no confirmed FDA commissioner. And Janet Woodcock, who is the acting commissioner of the FDA, she literally oversaw the largest failure of the FDA in its history by waving through. These companies were like, hey, this is heroin, but like we made it not addictive. And they're like, do you have any proof of that? And they're like, no. And they're like, oh, go. Sweet. That sounds awesome. And then they illegally marketed this to addict America. And we're facing an overdose crisis of almost unimaginable magnitude. And it's because of pharma, and it's because this bureaucrat, you can't have that happen unless you have the like hapless or evil bureaucrat who's like, these corporations probably have people's best interests at heart. And that wasn't an outlier, a drug that we pay attention to a lot because it's prescribed to institutionalized seniors and it ends up killing them. There was an $8 billion verdict against J&J on this drug, Risperdal, because it was illegally marketed to institutionalized children and seniors. We published a whole book on it. Hold on. I'll hold it up for him. A whole book on Janet Woodcock. This is just a book about how this company had a molecule that didn't do what it was supposed to do as an antipsychotic. And so they were like, what are we going to do with this? And they're like, I got an idea. Let's pour it down the throats of institutionalized people who have no ability to advocate for themselves. And we'll sell it to the institutions as this is going to dope these people up, and they'll be malleable. And it ends up killing a bunch of seniors, and with children, it caused a side effect that male children grew female breasts, and that's business as usual for these corporations. Janet Woodcock waved that one through, and the whole thing, it's just the magnitude of it. And then you're like, okay, well, did you learn anything from these? Janet Woodcock, acting director of the FDA, they just let a corporation use the FDA to approve, like we have the documents, they use the FDA as a part of their marketing plan for a drug that does not work, and they market it as like an Alzheimer's miracle, and against all of the expert panels that the FDA is supposed to rely on, who are saying no. And do you know who is in line for the confirmed commissioner position now, Natalie? Have you heard the scuttlebutt?
I haven't. I've been working on another project, so I've been trying to avoid the news.
Janet Woodcock. She's still in line for it after all of that. And the only person who they have as an alternative is Representative Auchincloss, who we ran a billboard truck against because he was standing in the way of farm. It's his mother, who is the pharma executive who bankrolled his congressional campaign. That is who is up for the head of the FDA. At the NIH, it's a person whose conflicts check is this long on all of the pharma. So it's like we just accept that this is the way it is, and all of the consequences of it are so disastrous. But I don't want to be bleak. I just want to put out there that all of what I just said, that's all true. But still, for whatever reason, people are like, I don't know, it can't be that bad. What are we supposed to do about it? And you're like, not let pharma into the hen house. Don't let them in there. So do you have a sort of alternative vision for what I just stated, which is clearly a bad way of going? What are some other ways that we could do this that would make more sense?
I mean, ultimately, I'm an advocate for public manufacturing. I think if we manufactured these things publicly, I mentioned earlier with insurance, our public insurance system does such a better job than the private insurance system and isn't subject to the same incentives. And public drug manufacturing could be that way too. It would give us control not only of what research gets done and what kinds of drugs we're looking into, so probably a few less like Rogaine and a few more, antibiotics, things geared toward really significant illnesses, some of the less lucrative type of research, maybe for diseases that afflict poor people. I think public manufacturing would also bring us out of the stranglehold, make us able to, determine how to distribute medicines publicly. If there's a price at all, what that price would be, obviously very subsidized. I think that, pharma really does call the shots, and it has an immense amount of power for many reasons. And one of the reasons is because of what it does. It doesn't have to be the only person performing those functions. And there's no reason that a private company can do anything or can do anything better than the government can in this particular case. People like Elizabeth Warren have come forward with proposals for that. It was recently passed in California, a measure for public manufacture. I don't really think it's gotten off the ground yet in any significant way, but it's fairly straightforward. It's something that we could do. It's something that would be popular, and it's something that would save a lot of money. The downside is that you will still have to contend with some of the chokeholds on political power that pharma currently has, which is going to be the roadblock. But that's going to be the roadblock no matter what. And we've got to figure out a way to change this.
Natalie, what is the thing that surprises you most reporting on this issue? Or does it just all feel predictable to you at this point?
I've been researching it for several years now. There's a tuberculosis poster in my office because I did my master's degree years ago on drug-resistant tuberculosis, and that's really how I fell down the pharma rabbit hole, getting very into, you know, how private pharma impedes public health in a number of ways in a number of countries. And I think that Alex is right that, you know, obviously I've always been a fairly progressive person, at least. I've moved to the left in recent years, but I think I always, you know, had an idea that pharma is bad, and that it's, you know, corporate greed and that kind of thing. I don't think I realized the extent to which I think pharma really is unique, even within a pretty dastardly category. I think that just the unilateral price setting, I think, is very surprising, especially when you have an understanding of how these things are done in other countries. The fact that there really is very little existing mechanism right now for the government to block anything that pharma wants to do, that they basically just set the sticker price and that's it. That's not how it works elsewhere. And I think that, you know, the fact that so much of the research and development is public, that, you know, their argument that we need these high prices to facilitate innovation isn't just less true than you'd think. It's basically not true at all. The vast, if not the vast majority, a very significant amount of significant R&D is put up by the government. And if we were doing more research and more drugs that were more squarely within the public interest, so not gearing it toward, you know, the more profitable blockbuster drugs that aren't necessarily as bedrock and important, I think then the number would be damn near 100%.
Mm.
So Natalie just did a very journalistic thing there, which I appreciate because, you know, I was just telling you about being fact checked by someone who doesn't understand the industry. What I'm pointing at is the private sector does put money into R&D, and they're the first ones to yell at you when they're like, the NIH is only $40 billion. We put in. What they consider research and development is literally up to them to decide. And I've talked about this before. They consider giving their drugs for free to providers research. They think of that as market research, which means advertising is counted as research. The research that they do is actually, hey, if we take this drug and add a molecule right here, and can it do the same thing as the previous drug, which is coming off of patent? They're not actually looking at, let's see what the public health demands. Let's see where we can increase the therapeutic value of these things. It's just to maximize profit, which is why I, as an advocate, not a journalist, Natalie, have no problem saying that it is all public. It's our tax dollars that create all the new molecules, all the breakthroughs, all the things that people sort of assume are created by these corporations are not. They're created by us, and then we hand them to the corporations. Corporations are innovators, like bleeding edge innovators. They're amazing, the amount of innovation that they have at extending their intellectual property rights. If you wanted to figure out how to screw over the public by creating like a huge maze of intellectual property, or corporate structures, right? They love buying up competitors, just handing bags of money to other companies and being like, don't create a generic form of our drug, even though you can, because we'll just keep handing you this bag of money if you don't do it. They do that. And we're like, what are we supposed to do? And you're like, not let them hand people bags of money. It's not that hard. But what you're talking about as well is the root cause of this. And I want to I don't know if you've ever seen our manifesto, publicmedicines.org, but I think you would enjoy it.
I think I've seen parts of it, yeah.
And in there, the second bullet point, it's 4 parts. So codify open science practices. Right. So like all data should be shared. It's the most asinine thing ever. all these people working on supposedly the same things, but in secret. So they're not learning from each other's mistakes. When someone was like, a while ago, they were like, oh my God, China is stealing the vaccine information from us. They hacked in, and you're like, why do they need to steal it? Why aren't we just sharing it with everyone? Mm-hmm. It's a pandemic. It can destroy humanity. We should all be working together. And they're like, come on, hippie, that would never work. And you're like, have you ever read about any science before the 80s? Because that is literally what we would used to do. That is how we eliminated things. The second one is create public sector capacity for full cycle pharmaceutical innovation and production of essential medicines. Yeah. And that's what you're talking about. And when we were doing the research, what just shocked us over and over again is that we're 99% of the way there. It's like we don't have to change much. Like we don't have to, you know, I say, and we say in here, we're like, oh yeah, we should double the NIH budget because we just should. That would be great. We should not let NIH people move into pharmaceutical sector, though. That would definitely help. But the last stage, when we just hand it away, that's all we need to do. Just stop doing that. And then, and maybe you'll judge me for this, we even are okay with like, don't do that. You don't even have to do it on everything, right? Like just on, like have them side by side so that, you know, the private research could come up with a new Rogaine and right. Like they could come up with things that are nice, but they're not actually like a bunch of people die. And the public sector could really make sure that there's no shortages of essential medicines, antibiotic, multiply drug resistant antibiotics, stuff like that. Can you delve into that a little bit? Like that we've got everything we need. Why do we give away the patent? Like, what is the justification for that?
Yeah, I mean, the justification for that's something that, you know, came largely through the Bayh-Dole Act, is what's known as facilitating that patent transfer more than anything else. And it was kind of born out of the same ethos as we're talking about, this idea that the private sector is uniquely equipped to spur innovation, and that we were just leaving all of this potential innovation on the table. And we've got to give them the patent so that they can really, you know, show us how it's done, bring us into the next century, blah, blah, blah. And you are right that the funny thing about that argument, it's not true, but if it was true, it's basically insisting that, you know, people respond to incentives. And I do think that's true. And you are right that one of the things that they are very good at innovating is new ways to screw around with patent law, new ways to, you know, change a pill just enough so that you can call it a different drug and get 14 more years of exclusivity, new ways to legally harass potential generics manufacturers from stepping in and impeding your exclusivity so that you no longer have a monopoly to charge whatever you want. You know, new ways to figure out how to cultivate relationships with doctors and run marketing campaigns that you are able to call R&D. I mean, all of those are perverse examples of innovation that really are sparked by the profit motive, and people don't think of them that way. So it's very frustrating that they want to insist on, you know, incentivizing innovation in one specific, you know, socially necessary way and not the more perverse version.
Just to push on it a little bit, because I love talking about this, and you do a really great job of making things understandable. The idea, or what they sell, even if it were true, right? And it's not, you just laid it right. Like, but even if what they were saying was true, like the only way we're going to get new drugs is by granting us a patent so that we can charge as high prices as we want. And that we use that. They don't use it for innovation. But even if it were true, hypothetical situation, it's still the dumbest way that you could ever set this up. It's literally then a tax on the people who need the drug the most, right? So it's a tax on people with cancer. It's a tax on families with kids with cystic fibrosis. It's a tax on sick people, a massive tax on sick people in order to fund innovation to address other illnesses and diseases. It makes no sense, except for this one way, which is so dumb it hurts. But you just have to know that DC has this thing called the CBO and the budget window. And if money doesn't appear on there, then it doesn't count, right? So they're like, oh yeah, we didn't spend any money on that. And you're like, but you gave away this thing that then, by charging the highest drug prices in the world, the federal government, as the largest purchaser of drugs, is paying all of that to pharma. You could take a fraction of that, move it to the beginning of the cycle, right? Invest the money in the beginning of the cycle, develop the drugs, have no patents. So it's just any company that wants to produce this molecule can, and they can compete, right? Like the American competition, a free market, actually. But you put the investment up front, and you don't do it through patents. So, like, why are we beholden? When were patents created? In the 1500s, right? It was like when they would set out like pirates, and the English crown was like, you know, we're going to grant. It's literally a 16th or 17th century concept that does not make any sense, sort of writ large, but especially on pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you also brought up a good point, as you know, high pharmaceutical prices being a tax on the sick. That's definitely a point that I make about cost sharing in health insurance design as well. The fact that, you know, any deductible, any copay is essentially a tax on the people that are using healthcare, that the people who don't have to use healthcare are essentially financially rewarded for being lucky enough to be healthy. And if you know that something costs a certain amount, you know, if you know that no matter how good things get, we're going to spend however many billions on drugs per year, why should that cost be distributed onto the shoulders of the people who are sick? You know, it is a very individualized, commodified framework. I think that should be more fairly distributed, and the people who are most able to pay should pay for those things. I also think that, you know, cost sharing is bad enough for enough people, their insurance designs, that's going to be something that we have to think about. That, you know, even if we are miraculously able to get some good legislation through that does address drug prices, I'm skeptical for a lot of reasons. It's really, you know, on a tightrope right now, who knows? But even if we are able to get those prices down, you know, lowering a price from something like $20,000 to $15,000 is still going to hurt a patient a whole lot. You know, there are far more problems than solely the price of these drugs, given how we pay for healthcare. You know, something that's at a lower price, you know, something like insulin. I think one of the reasons that insulin is such a big deal, I mean, there are a million reasons. I've written about insulin a lot, could go into a lot of them. But one is it's obviously very expensive, but it's also at a price point, you know, around $300 a vial that you often have to pay out of pocket. You know, if insulin, it couldn't be, if insulin was $40,000 a vial, obviously that would be complete pandemonium, but no one would pay for it out of pocket. Like that wouldn't happen. So, you know, being at a price point where people have to pay out of pocket can be, I think, really the difference between extreme harm and somewhat less harm on an individual basis. But of course, societally, we're all paying for it collectively.
Well, and this is something that, you know, we talk a lot about on here. It's regardless of, it's like you said, Natalie, I mean, it's an extreme privilege to be healthy, but it's also terrifying to live in a world where even a minor medical complication can lead to this amount of trauma and duress. The last thing you should have to worry about if you have a serious medical diagnosis is how much it costs.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's awful. It's, you know, it's not just the cost, and obviously that's a huge part of it. I think it's also the bills, the wrangling. You know, so often that administrative burden is shifted onto the patient, that, you know, an extremely expensive drug, you try to get it at the pharmacy, you can't afford it because your deductible went up, or, you know, whatever reason it went off formulary. And so now you have to call your insurer, who has to call the manufacturer or the PBM, whatever it is. You know, that kind of thing. I've talked to so many people who tell me stories about just bursting into tears on the phone, arguing with people, trying to get things covered, trying to figure out how to pay for a prescription that just shot up in price. It's really, it's people, a lot of people describe it as being worse than being sick in the first place.
Natalie, have you ever lived or accessed care in another country?
I have, yes.
And like, I feel like if more people accessed care in another country, they'd be like, what? Wait, I got sick and I just went to a doctor and the doctor said, do this. And then I got the drugs that I needed. And maybe I had to pay like $5. In France, there's a very minimal out of pocket. And so it is mind-blowing to me that Americans will actually, where it's not just that our system is absolute garbage, but the propaganda. Everyone hates pharma. You can poll after poll after poll. They're actually more hated than the federal government, which used to be the most hated institution because of Grover Norquist and Reagan and the neoliberals. But 2 years ago, pharma was below that. And just ask people, they hate them. But it's like locked in, like, oh yeah, but what else could we do? And you're like, you don't even have to look that far. Like, all around us, all of our peer nations have systems that are set up that are wildly better than ours. And so it's amazing. We talk about this on here a lot as well. And I don't like judge people because propaganda works. It works on me, works on you, works on all of us. And we are just inundated with it. But it is almost embarrassing to me that the people who this violence is perpetrated on, us, the American people, will actively defend this system and be like, I would rather die because I was not able to afford my drugs than I don't know what the alternative is, but I'm sure it's worse than me dying. And you're like, but I that's just me being angry about things. The idea that is under this is that price isn't actually the thing that I care about or that you care about or that all of us public healthy people care about. Mm-hmm. We don't care about price. What we care about is that people get the care that they need. If price is just a way that they restrict access, we allow corporations to actually restrict access to needed care through price. If they were doing it through another way, like if they had a dude outside the pharmacy hitting you with a baseball bat, we would design policy to get rid of that guy so that people would access their care. Yeah. All it is we are allowing corporations to create false scarcity because these molecules are not that hard to make. Biologics may be a little bit harder, but generally pharmaceuticals are not hard to make. They literally cost pennies to make. So it's false scarcity to withhold access so that some people can't get this so that other people will pay whatever they're told it costs. That is amazing to me that they've been able to pull off the grand hustle where they do that and they have the same people who they perpetrate violence on defend that system.
Yeah, I mean, it's unconscionable. And I also think that pharmaceuticals are a good way to illustrate the fact that, you know, you'd think, okay, on paper, we could do a public manufacturing system, you know, hopefully alongside Medicare for all. And that would save a lot of money, right? You'd think, oh my gosh, the government will be all over this. But no, of course it won't be. The government isn't trying to save money. The government is trying to serve capital. It is trying to, you know, grease the wheels of these businesses that they are hoping to work for in a few years, that their friends already worked for, that they previously worked for, that bankrolled their campaign, that held their fundraisers, that, sponsor whatever conferences they go to. I live in Boston. It is impossible to go anywhere without seeing pharmaceutical logos places. If you've ever been to a medical conference, it's completely obscene how many booths and signs, and the stage and the podium sometimes has a logo on it, just all over the place, constant barragement of these corporate logos. And that's done for a very specific reason, and those companies want to make money, not to save money. So when so much of the public and private individuals are paying for these drugs, there are a lot of people who would benefit from lower prices. They do not tend to be elected officials or the people who have the most access to them. So I think that that's an important thing to realize. I think that when I was younger, I just had this idea that, government has an interest in saving money, that sounds like it would make intuitive sense. But no, it's what's good for these companies. And so in a lot of cases, that's keeping prices high, and that's holding up legislation that could save billions of dollars because you want the prices to remain high.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, because it's another thing that we discuss a lot. A lot of Americans have the misconception that balancing a government budget is like balancing a household budget. It's not. Mm-hmm. It's not. And it's like you're saying, there is a concerted, not even subtle effort to invest in certain industries just so they can continue to exist. We see that a lot with energy too. And it's not necessarily a good thing, to say the least. But then to bait and switch and say investing in public health and, ecological preservation, things we all need to live, is somehow costly. What is a cost that's too much to pay for your own survival? I don't really know that even makes sense. But whether or not it makes moral sense, it also doesn't really make economic sense.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, so we're talking about, the U.S. Pharmaceutical companies insisting that they need such high prices because that's how they pay for innovation. We know that a lot of other countries pay a lot less for their drugs. And often pharmaceutical companies will counter and say, well, yeah, but part of the reason that they are able to pay so much less for their drugs is because the U.S. pays so much for the drugs. And I think that kind of like the idea that there should be no hit taken, that, there should be a zero-sum game, or even, I think ultimately if there is legislation that is passed that lowers certain drug prices, pharmaceutical companies will almost certainly raise other drug prices or find some money somewhere to try to make up the difference, which is part of why I'm somewhat skeptical about this legislation ultimately, even though I do want some form of it to pass. All that is to say, I think that we have to normalize the idea that there aren't always win-wins, right? Mm-hmm. Like there aren't ways for pharmaceutical companies and patients and public payers to win. Someone does have to lose. The pharmaceutical companies have to lose. They have to make less money. They have to take a hit. They have to have fewer advantages. And that means that a lot of investors have to take a hit too. That probably means that some, retirement accounts have to take hits. Like it's not going to be easy, but it is going to require a robust confrontation. It's going to require class war. Like pharmaceutical companies need to be weaker. They need to have smaller margins. And I don't think that we are going to have anything remotely resembling an equitable healthcare system until that happens.
Yes. Where I want to get, how I want, or one way that I want to get there is I really do want people to understand and that, this is not an industry of scientists in lab coats. This is an industry of sociopathic predators in $7,000 suits who are actually private equity barons. And they don't care at all about anything except money. And so what they do is they purchase portfolios of intellectual property, and they, you know, in all predatory capitalism, they're looking for undervalued assets or overvalued assets. Overvalued assets is what they used to call people's companies' pension funds. When the barons really started, they would go into a company and they're like, oh, that's an and what they meant is, we're going to steal all of the money from the workers, and we're going to cut this company up and we're going to sell it off for parts. And then we're going to be like, oh, shucks. And that's why we don't have Toys R Us anymore. And that makes me sad. That's why we don't have KB Toys. That's why we don't have toy stores anymore. Private equity. Now, the sort of other side is they go into these pharmaceutical these pharmaceutical intellectual property banks, and they see a drug. And I want everyone to know that, like, what they really want is not a huge drug. So the only people who hate Martin Shkreli more than the American public are other pharmaceutical executives, because he was doing what they all do, but he did it too loud. He blew up their spot. And then he bought the Wu-Tang album, and they're like, what's up with you, bro? Because what they like to do is find a drug that has a population that's like large so they can make money, but not large enough that it has any power, right? Like 300,000 children, and they're like, yes, this is the one that I want. And then they get that molecule, and then they raise the price to whatever they want. That's the part that is shocking, right? Like, that we allow them with no stop. You're like, well, what do you want us to do? And you're like, it's easy. Every other country in the world just says no. The pharmaceutical corporations are like, hey, we're going to charge you $1 million for this drug. And the government's like, no, we're not going to pay that. We'll pay you $50. So these corporations are not at all interested in the public good. It's not like, oh, they have a bifurcated mission statement like the Fed, you know, like it is actually their sole purpose is to make money. That's it. And we are the product. That's what predatory financialization is. They see sick people as profit centers, and they see care as a cost center. They want to exploit the system that we have to drag money out of us. And once they've picked our pocket of all the cash, then they come for our health. And once they've taken our health, then they will kill us. They'll take our lives. They financialize us from birth to grave. And I want people to understand that no pharmaceutical corporation is on your side at all. You should think of them as literally the perfect villain. And you should be like, I'm going to fight this villain and all the villainous deeds that they do. And, you know, for the workers who work within these corporations and the system, it's not them. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about the C-suite. I'm talking about the private equity barons behind them. But that's what's driving the industry. It's not science. It's not care. It's not patience or healing people. It's money. It's aggressive financialization of every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, and I think that also brings up this idea that, you know, I think it is important to hate them and realize how the structure works. And it's also important to realize that you can't just shame them into being nicer. You know, be better, pharmaceutical executives. Okay, you know, if one came along that wanted to be better, you know, every once in a while they will ceremoniously lower the price of a drug that's gotten a special amount of attention, and then just privately jack up others to, you know, make up the margins. But they will not take the hit that I was talking about them needing to take, you know. And if they decided to try, you know, if some nice pharmaceutical executive somehow manages to climb to the top without being a complete sociopath, which would be tough to begin with, but just pretending that that could happen. Yeah, so okay, they're going to try to make less money, have lower returns. They're going to lose investors. They're not going to be able to, you know, buy up the molecules. Their competitors are going to get contracts instead of them, blah, blah. They will eventually just wither into nothing and won't be able to to perform the function that they are there to perform. And so that isn't to say, oh, they have no choice, don't get mad at them. It's to say this is only a problem that can be handled with public oversight, good regulation. I think public manufacturing, we just don't need these companies, and nothing good comes from having them.
I agree. And Jocelyn, just one quick follow-up just to throw it out there, because I like making sure that people know that we should also nationalize the vaccine industry, because there's everything that we've said about pharmaceutical molecules, there's absolutely no way that vaccines and vaccine production can be done by a profit-seeking corporate entity, because by nature, vaccines do not make money. And by nature, there is no way that a profit-seeking company could invest what's necessary in creating the vaccine for to prevent the next pandemic. It would be like if we had private nuclear arsenals, right? Like, and just as people would be like, that's ridiculous. That's how ridiculous it is to let these corporations actually own and be in charge of vaccines. We face right now, a literal human existential threat with a pandemic. We are one mutation away from a mortality rate that could cease the human species. If that happens, I personally hope that lemurs take over. I know they're still in the primate family, and maybe we should give another branch a chance, but lemurs are awesome. They're the best primates. But my point is, we should have in our brains the understanding that private profit-seeking system cannot, by nature, do some of the things that we're talking about in healthcare. Like, it's not a product. Our health is not a product. And so economics says, well, what's your willingness to pay for this product? And you're like, for my life, it's literally everything I have and everything I can borrow. That is why we have to remove that profit motive from all things healthcare. And vaccines, we should do it yesterday. Moderna, get rid of them. Let's call it the Dolly Parton vaccine. It's fully owned by the U.S. Taxpayers. Let's give that to the entire world and vaccinate the world. Let's pay to set up mRNA manufacturing plants all around the world and vaccinate the world. And sort of in my I'll end this on the hopeful note. I hate pharma with this burning passion because I love science so much. And so, like, there's a thing that sometimes happens where you hate pharma, and that might lead to being like, this mRNA vaccine is evil because pharma is evil. And you're like, no, the mRNA vaccine is a medical miracle. It's scientifically amazing, and it opens up so many doors for the future. And if we removed pharma from the equation, so much vaccine hesitancy would go away. If you weren't even able to conceive of that, right? It was just like, nope, it's not an evil corporation that's in behind this. So there are large swaths, and obviously we fight for Medicare for all, we fight public manufacturing, all public medicines, but like really crystallizing that even if they wanted to do the right thing, the system would not allow them to do the right thing. I think it would be way more violent than withering, Natalie. I think that what you'd see is the moment there was weakness in the C-suite, like the moment some CEO pulled the Jerry Maguire and was like, who's with me? Hostile takeover, right? Like, it would be immediate. Capital would act like that, and that company would cease to exist, and it would be part of another company that continues the sociopathic mission of extracting wealth by restricting health. That's not a question, but if you want to dunk on how capitalism can't actually deliver what we're looking for, that's an invitation to do it.
I will. I think I'd also just like to speak for the viewers out there, myself included, who had no idea that lemurs were primates.
Oh, yeah.
I thought they were like a raccoon type thing.
There are.
Really, I was thinking about that for the first 30 seconds or so that you were talking. That was really just blowing my mind. That's wild.
I also will point out that slow lorises are lemurs, and slow lorises are in fact primates. So I really want, you know, like they're in our, they're cousins of ours. Those cute little ones with the big eyes.
That changes everything. But yes, I mean, you are right. And yeah, at the end of the day, it is funny. There is this distrust of big pharma that makes people want to turn against all of their products and just, you know, go find some herbal remedies instead, maybe learn a few magic spells. And ultimately, I really want there to be good, effective drugs. Pharma fulfills a socially necessary function. So many drugs have been completely life-changing over the course of history, have changed the way that people live. And I think that that's wonderful. And it's so wonderful that I want that to be under public control. I don't want it to be privatized. I want us to all have access to it. I want it to be subject to democratic accountability. I want it to be available for everybody who needs it. And if this was a less important industry, it would matter a lot less.
Well,
Jocelyn, you want to close this out here?
Yeah, I guess, Natalie, I know that this isn't necessarily your job, but what would you tell people that want to get involved? And like, who are you? I mean, what would your ideal reader take away from your work?
That's an interesting question. Thank you. I guess what I try to write is I try to use news pegs as a way to analyze the healthcare and political system more broadly. You know, trying to use each thing as just a dip in the water and kind of show how it radiates outward and, you know, how to think about it. And, you know, I think that healthcare is an unfortunately very effective way of understanding capitalism and understanding power in politics and how all of those things work. So, you know, I try to write about that. I try to advance those ideas. I definitely want public manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, but I also want Medicare for all. Like I said, I think that, you know, somewhat better prices for drugs is only going to do so much if people still have to pay them out of pocket. So I want that to be publicly provisioned too. I think that those two things really have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely agree with that.
Natalie Shure, columnist from The New Republic. Thank you so much for joining us on Solidarity Live and for all of your work. If you haven't read her, what's your Twitter handle? Can people follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, it's at Natalie Shurely, Surely. Dopey pun I came up with 11 years ago and I'm now stuck with. So
and do it, because Natalie is an absolutely amazing writer and is exposing a lot of stuff in a very easy to digest way that just again shows that we can build the world that we're talking about. We can have Medicare for all. We can have public manufacturing of pharmaceuticals. We just need to together demand it. We can do all of these things with solidarity, but only when we realize that all of us together have so much more power than the few people right now who are saying, oh, you can't change anything. You don't know how it all works. It's way more complex than that. It's not. It's just about power, and all the power is in the hands of the people. When we remember that and feel it and wield it, that's when we can build that world that we're talking about.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.